Very happy to be live with Craig Russell. It took us some to sort this chat out, didn't it? It's great to have you here.
Great to be
do you
here.
want to start us off with an introduction to yourself and your book?
Yes, I'm Craig Russell. I've written, and I struggle believing this, but I've written 16 novels now, most of which have been crime mystery. A couple of series, the Lennox series set the 1950s in Glasgow, the Fable series set in contemporary Hamburg. But most of my stuff tends to be historical, sometimes recent historical, and I would say a lot of it is either noir tinged or gothic tinged. And my latest outing, The Devil's Playground, is a little bit of both. It's noir with real gothic tones. It takes place in silent era Hollywood, 1927, right on the cusp of talkies coming along, and it concerns the death of a glamorous silent movie star who has been starring in the yet to be released movie, The Devil's Playground, which is being billed as the greatest horror movie ever made.
And it plays with that boundary of where crime meets horror, doesn't it, really well as a novel, because you've got the kind of horror movie.
Yes, yeah, it was a bit of a balancing act because to put it very bluntly, very simply, silent movies are scary. I mean, as a form, as a medium, there was something dark and quite sinister about them, particularly the horrors. But it also took me into the sort of birth of the noir era as well. So the protagonist in this is Mary Rourke, who is a fixer for one of the major studios, and she gets unwillingly drawn into the investigation of this horror movie star's death. So yes, there's this sort of balance between noir and horror. As I said, a touch of the gothic running through it.
Were there really interesting kind of cast of, because it's told in, I don't know how much we can give away, but it's told in sort of different time periods, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. See, one of the things that people ask me why I am so fascinated by that particular period. I mean, I'm a cinephile, so I love movies. I love the history of movies in Hollywood, so very much invested in that. But the reason the 20s fascinate me, and the reason the 20s fascinate me is because that's a century ago. So it's exactly 100 years ago, but it doesn't feel like 100 years ago. And it's because our world, the modern world, was born then, and a lot of the things that we take for granted as part of our sort of culture now, and part of our technological life, the genesis was in the 1920s. Yet the 1920s were a heartbeat away from the Victorian era. And I found that fascinating. So yes, we dip in without going, as you say, giving away any spoilers. We dip into the personal histories of some of these very modern 1920s Hollywood personalities, but their histories are, it's, we don't go that far back yet. We seem to be going back 2 centuries. So yes, that was it was just such it was such fun to play with these different times and periods. Um, so yeah, no, it has more than the one period, and of course it has a storyline that takes place in 1967, which brings us even closer to the contemporary world.
What drew you into that love of cinema? So you said you're a cinephile. You obviously like the history of the 20s. That's what you touched on. But what drew you into that love of?
I don't know, just being a kid, in the 60s, the early 60s, and becoming exposed to some of the the classic movies were still being shown, if you like, on mainstream TV back then, and the you would get this sort of midnight feature on a Friday night, and sometimes on a Saturday night, where you would get these old horror movies, things like Frankenstein and Dracula and all that kind of thing. And I grew up with that chiaroscuro, black and white, shadowy aesthetic, if you like, with movies, and it led me. I mean, without being boring about it, German expressionism was brought into Hollywood with the horror movies in the silent era, and then developed into film noir in the 30s. So being exposed to that kind of movie at a young age, sort of just captured my imagination, and I've stayed with it. Obviously, I'm interested in contemporary film as well, but that's where my love of Gothic horror was born as well.
And that's what's inspired sort of the kind of hints of Gothic in all of your books.
Well, I think that, and the
your books, you were saying.
Yes, I think that, and a lot of the literature I read when I was younger. I read a lot of Gothic fiction, from Dracula to Edgar Allan Poe, that kind of thing. So it was a mixture of the two. But I find, and I've got to be careful not to get too boring about this, but there's a connectivity between them that I find fascinating. There was a movie made, a Czech-German silent movie called Der Golem, and if you watch that movie, you can see how that evolved into Frankenstein's monster. But if you dig into the literary background, you find that Mary Shelley actually visited the site where the golem was supposed to be confined, and that in part inspired her to write the original novel. So there's this. I find that really fascinating, and it's inspired me. The continual cross-referencing and the circularity of the ideas, of the concepts, of the aesthetic between the literature and the movies. So no, I find that all fascinating, and it had a huge influence on me. And the other thing, one thing I try to do is to imagine what it was like seeing these things for the first time, and trying to share with the readership the scale of some of these movies and the stars that were in them. I actually wrote something recently about, when Boris Karloff appeared on screen as Frankenstein's monster. It's parodied now. We've had everything from the Munsters on TV in the 60s to kids going to fancy dress in a Frankenstein outfit. But when that movie came out, there were people fainting in cinemas, and it was banned in 13 states in the US and in several countries around the world, including Ireland. Karloff's presence at the time was just seen as being just too terrifying. And when I was writing The Devil's Playground, I wanted to try to dig into that, to try to communicate that sense of just imagine what it was like the first time to see some of these movies.
What do you think? So it's an interesting concept, that, isn't it? Because obviously some of what makes us parody things like that now is that our technology has moved on and visuals and everything have moved on. But what do you think kind of makes us sort of keep pushing that boundary of scariness?
I don't know. I think the move to parody with some of these things is simply familiarity breeds contempt. That we've seen them so many times, and they've become embedded in our culture so much that they've lost their sting. They've lost their ability to scare. I think that it's when the medium was young, there were things you could do that could be sort of relatively restrained but have more power because of that. But as time has gone on, I mean, what we do now is we try to, movie makers make things more explicit. The violence is more graphic. There are more deliberate jump scares, that kind of thing, and it's because the medium is no longer young, and we have seen a lot of what can be done, and it becomes increasingly difficult to do something new, to scare people in new ways. But what I think is that a lot of very explicit horror, I very often find comical, and of course we now have that crossover where you have the comedy horror. But I think there is still room for psychological horror, and I think there are movie makers like A24 who made Midsommar and the likes. There are people still trying to use unease. That's what I think we've lost, is a lot of the unease we used to build into into fiction generally, but specifically into movies.
There's I always think that the scariest things are the ones that leave a suggestion rather than tell you the whole thing. You know, think about The Haunting of Hill House. That's like the most
Yes,
terrifying thing I've ever read, and
yes,
nothing is explicitly described.
yes. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the best horror in either medium, literary or filmic, the most powerful tool you have at your disposal is the reader or the viewer's imagination. There's no doubt about that. And that's why I think that unease works much better, because you're literally planting some sort of psychic seed in the mind of the viewer or the reader, and they cultivate it in their own way.
There's sorry, I'm just looking at the questions we've got coming up. So we've got some hellos from like TG, Patsy Forsyth. I know you've met her. She's got some of your books signed. She's just telling you further down the screen that we had a swap of your books.
Oh, right.
At a recent live event, because we were talking about you coming on and the Devil's Playground and things, and we were trading some books to read by you with each other because she really likes your books.
Yeah.
TG wants to know which of your characters you'd entertain for a meal out.
Sorry.
TG wants to know which of your characters you'd take out for a meal.
Oh, now that's a really, really interesting question, because I've always, with the Fable series, for example, I think Jan Fable we would have much more in common, but Lennox, if you wanted a night out on the town, it would be it would be Lennox you'd want to go out with, because it would be quite something. Mind you, it would be 1950s Glasgow, so it wouldn't be a lot of good food available, but there would certainly be quite a bit of drink taken. But I think most of my protagonists I like. I really like Mary Rourke in The Devil's Playground, because, without going into her personal history, she's overcome a great deal and is in a very cynical industry and a very cynical kind of job, yet she has remained reasonably immune to cynicism. So I find her a very sympathetic character.
Yeah, Mary is a great character. What I liked about her as well in the book is that you've got kind of 1920s Hollywood, and the role she's in, you don't necessarily expect to be done by a woman.
This opens up a whole area that was absolutely, I knew some of it just from my sort of background knowledge, but when I investigated, when I was doing my research, it was incredible. People of color and women were much better represented in Hollywood in the 1920s than they are actually in the 2020s. Some of the most powerful people in Hollywood were women, and women were involved in every aspect of filmmaking, in front and behind the camera. From scripting or scenario writing, to people like Tressie Souders, who was an African American woman film director. And if you look at Hollywood now, there are what, a handful of female film directors now, but back then women were much better represented in Hollywood, and that was the strange thing about it, because it was this sort of island in what was a very conservative First World War USA. But Hollywood was it was different. It was a thing. It was an identity in and of itself, which had been created by accident. It just so happened that the weather was good there, and in the days before artificial lighting, that meant you could film for 300 days of the year. And because the film industries in Europe had been, which had led Germany, Denmark, Italy, they had been decimated by the First World War. Hollywood became the global center of filmmaking. So it was, and it grew with amazing rapidity, and it became this unique place where, as I say, women would find opportunities that they would not find elsewhere in the US. African Americans could find opportunities that they couldn't find elsewhere in the US. And there was a thriving African American film industry with the Lincoln Motion Picture Company and others making social dramas. And being unrestrained by the sort of bigotries around them, except when they released the movies. When the movies went out to market into the wild, then they were going out to segregated audiences in the South and that kind of thing. But it was a fascinating place in that respect. And as I say, women worked in every aspect of filmmaking. And it was, no stretch for me to have a female protagonist as a fixer in Hollywood.
That's really, I would not, like, obviously that went against what you would expect.
So yes, absolutely.
No, that's I did not know that. That's like really fascinating. There's so many other questions that we've been asked. You've been asked who your favorite authors are.
Oh, good grief. That's a very long list. I started off when I was young. There were so many. Ray Bradbury was a huge influence, and he was an influence because he's described as a science fiction writer, but he never described himself as such. He sort of crossed genres, and I think through him, I learned that you can paint whole new worlds, which are disconcertingly like the real world, that kind of thing. So he had a huge influence, and I read, I read everything when I was a kid. But my favorite authors, I would say, Heinrich Böll, the German author, has been a huge influence. He wrote what is known as Trümmerliteratur, which is rubble literature, and it was about Germany, flattened, destroyed Germany after the Second World War, and there was a power and a grittiness to his writing that really appealed to me. And when I wrote the Lennox series, obviously, and yeah, Chandler is was a Chandler fan as well, and Chandler influenced the Lennox series. But when I wrote the Lennox series, or created the character of Lennox, there's a short story by Heinrich Böll called Blasse Anna, Pale Anna, and it's about a man returning from the war to Cologne, I think it is, which has been completely destroyed. And it's just, yeah, and he's waiting for this girl he had admired from afar before he was sent to war. He's waiting for her to come back to this apartment building. And there was something about the description of that returned man that was hugely influential. It's strange, just a very short story that was hugely influential in the creation of Lennox. So, Heinrich Böll would be one of my favorite writers, but William Trevor, there's so many that, and it always depends. I don't know what it's like for most readers, but I drift. I move from one genre to another, from one style to another, and I think, generally speaking, it would, without sounding pompous, it's tended to be more sort of classic authors that I tend to gravitate towards and enjoy. John Steinbeck, for example. George Orwell convinced me to become a writer. I mean, not personally, but reading 1984. So yeah, there's a lot of favorite authors.
I can see what you were saying about Ray Bradbury and there's elements of the Devil's Playground that definitely have a heart to sort of
Yes.
Ray Bradbury, isn't there?
Yes. I'm not going to say what it is, but there's one particular nod. You've picked it up. Yes.
Yeah, I love his books as well, and there is definitely a really good nod to his books in there.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's also that feeling, like you were saying, that he creates. There's definitely sometimes that kind of powerful, close, but also slightly wrong feeling.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, I read a lot of his stuff when I was young, and it had a massive effect. I don't know if you've ever read the short story The Scythe. It's to me, it's just because I used to read an awful lot of short fiction from Chekhov, Gogol, across the range. But The Scythe is set in the Depression, in the Dust Bowl. This family, father, mother, two kids, their Model T truck is running out of gas, and they just come to a halt at this farm, which is in this dust bowl, but it's got this field of perfect corn behind it. And the father goes in and finds the farmer lying dead, dressed in his Sunday best, holding a scythe. And the scythe is inscribed with "He who wields me wields the world." You're in. You get to that stage, and that's it. He draws you right in. And I remember, reading The Scythe, reading A Sound of Thunder, and just thinking, again, sort of determining me on this path to becoming a writer, because just thinking, what a wonderful way to make your living, to build worlds like that and play with people's emotions.
TG on here is saying she loves Steinbeck. I've had this conversation with another author. I cannot get on with John Steinbeck as an author.
Yeah,
I think it's mental scarring from high school.
Oh, it could be. It could be. The name's gone. There's this. Nope. Senior moment. The author's name's gone. Oh, the old one, Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway is an author that I've always felt I should like, that should resonate with me, but it's the same thing. It just refuses to float my boat at all. I just can't get into Hemingway, and I've tried. A Farewell to Arms I enjoyed, but other than that,
I'm with you on the Hemingway.
yeah,
Doesn't work for me either. So you were saying, like, reading, you've read a lot of short fiction. Do you write short stories as well?
I started off writing short fiction because this is the absolute truth. I didn't think I had the attention span to write a novel. So I started off, which if that statement reveals a failure to understand short fiction, because short fiction isn't easier to write than a novel. It's a completely different form. And it is a much more challenging form. You're working in a much smaller space. But yes, it started off with short fiction, and then thought I'm going to have a go at writing a full-length novel, and the result was Blood Eagle, the first of the Fable novels.
So someone has asked you on the thread, I didn't see who the name was because it doesn't always come up with a thing, saying that you asking if you're going to Bloody Scotland. And I'm going to guess you may well be, because you are currently longlisted for the McIlvaine.
I am, yes. And I'm appearing with Liam McIlvanney. We're doing an event together. So yes, I will be at Bloody Scotland this year.
So I really need to go to Bloody Scotland, but book festivals always happen. Like, I've got a day job that you can't just leave.
Yes.
Like, they always happen, and then like start midweek and things, and I'm like, I can't go.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's it's I enjoy going to Bloody Scotland, and been very lucky with the McIlvanney Prize in the past, which is why I don't think I'll win this year. I think that would be pushing it, but no, I enjoy Bloody Scotland, but as you know, I've been published various places around the world, and that was one thing that was becoming quite difficult for me, was attending all of these book festivals in other countries, because I was getting very concerned. It was just such hard work getting to and from a lot of these festivals, but I was also becoming very concerned about my carbon footprint. But one of the things that very little positive has come out of our experience over the last few years, but one of the things is people are now more open to these blended events. So, I've appeared in a German festival where it was all done via Zoom, so I didn't have to travel. Sterling's not a problem, but you know, sort of flying over to Germany and then traveling into the sort of, because they're never close to an airport. But Stirling isn't a problem, so I'll be at Bloody Scotland, that's for sure.
Do you go to any other UK book festivals? Do you ever do you come down to Harrogate, places like that?
Yes, well, I don't know how many times I've done Harrogate, Capital Crime in London, and I've done that. But yes, yeah, I do. I do the occasional festival elsewhere if I can fit it in with my writing schedule, which is always, it's always quite demanding.
I've been recommended another one of your books further up the stream. I think that was Patricia as well. Probably. She's telling me what I need to buy next.
Oh, right. So what's being recommended?
What's been recommended? The Devil Aspect.
Oh, yes, yes.
You're saying I would really like it.
I think you would actually. Yes, I think that might be a good fit for you. I think it's set in the newly formed Czechoslovakia immediately before the Second World War, in an asylum with the devil's six most terrifying criminally insane murderers in Europe are confined there, and a psychiatrist is trying to find the devil aspect, this psychological element that has driven them all to commit these crimes. So the reason I think you would like it is very much a traditional, like, sort of classic horror setup. It's and I loved writing that book. I had such fun, and the research in the Czech Republic was brilliant. It was superb.
I'm a bit weird. I like horror books, and I can read quite a range of them. I did finish The Haunting of Hill House in broad daylight and wouldn't let my husband leave the room until I'd finished. It was scary. But I can't watch horror movies.
Oh, really?
No, they absolutely. I've got my best friend. Or one of my best friends is an art teacher, and he makes horror props and sells them as a second business. And his idea of being your friend is buying you horror movies for like your birthday and things. And they absolutely terrify me. I'm like, I can't watch this.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, as we discussed, there are horror movies and horror movies. It's I don't like slasher type horror movies at all. As we discussed, I think more the psychological, the suspenseful, the unease, that, and I lap that up.
You've also been asked, and I'm going to combine these two questions because they go together. What your favourite drink is while you're writing? Random question. And what your favourite biscuit is?
Oh, right. I drink. Again, this is definitely not we're not in Ernest Hemingway territory here. I drink copious amounts of tea when I'm writing. In fact, I drink copious amounts of tea non-stop. I very seldom drink. No, I drink at the weekend. I never really drink when I'm writing, funnily enough. And to answer the biscuit question, it's probably it would be between a Jaffa cake and a Tunnock's caramel. That would be not very sophisticated, but that's what it would be. But the thing about drinking, and not drinking alcohol when I'm writing, I remember, didn't get plastered or anything, but I had a couple of glasses of wine when I was working one night, and it was just flowing. I was working away, and I thought, oh yeah, I get it. I get it. Why I understand why writers drink. It opens up the muse and that kind of thing. Of course, I read everything the next day, and it was total crap. It was just awful, a whole lot. So no, I don't really drink alcohol when I'm working. And the funny thing is, I researched with different characters, writers, and whatnot. And the ones who were really, really bad drunks never wrote when they were drunk. They would go dry while they were. Generally speaking, I mean, some of them weren't, but generally speaking, they would go dry. So my experience of alcohol not mixing with creativity is probably not uncommon.
You do realise that bloody Scotland now, you're going to get random people turning up with boxes of Jaffa cakes and tea bags.
Then, yes, that's perfect. Yes,
like an author treat. I think we should all do it. It's,
yes. No, the only thing about the tea is I drink it embarrassingly weak. So, and I don't know what it is about weak tea that seems to inspire disgust in a lot of people. But
you're safe with me. I don't drink tea. I'm coffee only.
Right. Yes. Yeah. No, I like a nice cup of coffee, but if I have two, then I'm wired to the moon.
No, I've got the teacher immunity to caffeine. Drink too much of it, and then just I'm likely to take a cup of coffee to bed with me and still go to sleep. It's fine. So sorry, I'm going up to. Well, TG wants to know what your favourite area or county would be to write in if you had a choice. What was your dream writing location?
I live in Perthshire, and I like the environment that are right in, and I do find I genuinely do find that I need to be surrounded by nature rather than. I mean, it'd be different for different writers, but for me, I enjoy being in nature rather than in a sort of urban setting. And Perthshire would be the perfect county for me.
You've also been asked how you plan your books. Do you have a spreadsheet, notebook, or a whiteboard? This could be Sarah Blackburn who's asked this question, but I can't see the name, so if I'm wrong, I apologise, Sarah, because I know she's commented further down.
The answer to that is yes, and it can be all of the above, or none of them. It's the weirdest thing. I will very often sort of work away in this and write down sort of rough ideas. I might even start writing, parts of the book. and then I don't know what it is. I get to a point that it's not for reference or anything like that. It's for the, I think it's for the mental exercise, and it gets my brain into the place where I'm ready to go, and then I switch to the computer, to the Mac, and just work directly onto the screen. The way I've described my planning is, if you imagine you're traveling somewhere, you know where you want to go. Uh, say, traveling from here to London. I have to fix that destination, and then fix waypoints, places I want to visit on the way. So I have that. I tend to always know how the book's going to end. Sometimes I write the ending before I write the beginning. And then some of the key elements in the journey. But I always allow that's about as detailed as it gets, because I always allow myself the luxury of going on detours as I make the journey, and reacting to things that I encounter upon the way, because I don't have a research phase and a writing phase. The two things tend to be simultaneous, and sometimes when I'm writing and researching, I'll discover something that will change the course of the novel, positively or negatively. I mean, negatively, it can be I discover something that makes what I had planned not realistic in that time or period or context, or I just find something that is so fascinating and offers such a hook for the reader that I want to pursue that. So that's broadly how I do it. So people ask you, are you a plotter or a pantster? And I'm neither, and I'm both, if you know what I mean.
I think a lot of authors are probably a mixture of the.
Yes, yeah. I can't remember which author it was. Said, yeah, the advice you'll get from every author is that you've got to sit down and plan your novel in great detail so that you know what you're doing. But practically no author does that, because I mean, it will work for some, but generally speaking, I think that could be quite creatively curtailing.
So we've got some. I know these two comments here are both Leslie Lloyd, because she said hello both.
Hi, Leslie.
But she's not put a name on the next bit, but that it's also Leslie, because she said she just wanted to say that she really enjoyed The Devil's Playground. And I know Leslie really enjoyed The Devil's Playground, because when I reviewed it and it got like 5 stars from me, and I don't give away many 5-star reviews, we had quite a nice discussion afterwards when she was writing her review about what we liked about it.
Oh, that's great. No, that's good. So what did your conversations reveal? What of course, we've got to be careful not to give away spoilers.
I think it would give away spoilers, but we were sort of drilling into kind of the characters that we really liked. There's a character in the Bayou that I really enjoyed.
Yes.
That was probably my favourite. We talked about sort of how it starts out one way and you kind of think it's going in one direction, and then it really isn't at times. What you were thinking, I can't remember now, because it was a while ago that we had this conversation, and I don't have
Yes.
but yeah, we had quite an in-depth chat and
Yes.
reviews, which is quite nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, yeah, I don't. I'm never sure whether my work is plot driven. I think it's more. I think it is actually more character driven. I like to have very strong plots. But it's interesting that you say that about the character, because I actually think I don't know. This was very much a standalone, but I think I would maybe like to return to Mary Rourke at some point in the future. I think her I like her as a character, and yeah, I think she's an interesting person, but she's living through these incredibly interesting times. So I may return to Mary Rourke at some point in the future.
I hope that you do. It's good to hear. I
Yeah.
would read more with Mary in.
Yes. Oh well. Yeah. I already have an idea, but we need to see see how the Devil's Playground takes off.
Hopefully, well. Uh, Patricia's saying that. I mean, it's already longlisted for a prize, isn't it? So
Yes.
that's a good start. Patricia's talking about her afternoon teas she arranges for authors and readers up in Scotland. She's telling you to get in contact with her.
Oh right.
They're in Edinburgh, but apparently there may even be a Perthshire one at some point.
Oh.
I don't know the difference between the two, or how far the distance is between the two, if that makes sense.
Ah, right. Okay. Ah, right. Well, Dundee's not that far away. Sorry, I'm trying to. I'm getting you. Sorry, I've just had my eyes tested. I'm getting new glasses, so I'm reading these comments, and I'm doing an Eric Morecambe.
At least you're getting new glasses.
Yeah.
Asked about your research. So I'm guessing that sort of with the Devil's Playground, because you already knew quite a lot about the history and things. What was your research like for that? So it seems to draw on things that you love. Was it different to how you'd research a different book, or?
I I think it was, like you say, writing the devil aspect, the research into that book I loved, but I don't think I've ever enjoyed research as much as researching the Devil's Playground, because it was all of the stuff that I'm so interested in, and I've often said, when you write about something you think you know about, you discover very quickly that you know nothing about it, because so much comes out. But I absolutely loved the research, because it just exposed so much. And I keep saying about how similar it was. That world, that time, 100 years ago, was very similar in some ways to what we're going through now, because they had just come out of a pandemic, as we have. Their pandemic, of course, was even worse. Much worse. It was so deadly, the Spanish flu. As we speak right now, there's a strike going on in Hollywood. The writers, absolutely, totally right. They're striking because studios are increasingly using AI. I mean, there are some sort of superhero type movies that you can see where they could hand it over to AI to write. So a lot of the background to the industrial action is because of AI, the threat of AI, and the threat of this technological advance in the movie industry and in the entertainment industry. going back to The Devil's Playground in 1927, what cast a massive shadow over everything was the microphone. You know, this new technology that was going to that was going to change everything for the studios as well, because the technology had been around for a long time. For over a decade, they could have been making talkies, sound movies, but it made no commercial sense because silent movies were totally international. They had massive markets. The US, they didn't make American movies; they made global movies, and a lot of studios realized if they made talkies, then their market would shrink. But what happened was the microphone led to so many changes, cultural changes in society, and one of them was radio. It was radio that drove the change to talkies because people had this new technology at home and they could hear celebrities, they could hear actors. Fox Movietone started to produce sound newsreels, which people watched and listened to, and they could hear the president, they could hear actors, and that drove the change in from silent movies to talkies, and it was a cataclysmic event, a technology-driven event that had repercussions for so many people in Hollywood and around the world. And that would, I don't want to get boring about this, but that was one of the things that really fascinated me. There were, it's difficult to imagine this, but there were a lot of suicides of musicians because we think of the silence as being silence, and they weren't. There were full orchestras. Some of the bigger cinemas would have a full orchestra and would play a score along with the movie. And all of these musicians were out of work overnight because of it. So I find it fascinating. It was really surprising just how many similarities there were between the 1920s and the 2020s.
So again, that's really fascinating. When you think about it, it does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, you don't think about, you don't realize it, but you know the microphone, for example. Until then, I mean, this is not movie related, but it was the invention of pop music, because until then it was singing. You know, popular singers were vaudeville acts, or in the UK, music hall acts, and they had to do this sort of semi-operatic projection, just because of the size of the venues they were singing into. And then came the microphone, and it was there, and people could change the way they sang. And you had, all of a sudden, you had the crooner came along, and from the crooner came every popular music form, every pop singer from there on. You know, the creation of popular music to the Beatles, to Adele, to whatever. It was then, you know, in the 1920s. So again, it was the subtle changes that were affected back then that I hadn't really thought about until I actually started to dig into the research.
We're at the end of our time, but just remind people, if they've been watching this chat and found it interesting, what they are going to go away and buy.
It is The Devil's Playground, set in 1927 Hollywood, and it's about the greatest horror movie ever made, and which is supposed to be a cursed production, and all of the deaths that are associated with it.
And it's a marvelous read, so everyone
Thank you.
go away and make sure that you do buy it.
That's what I like to hear, yes.
And then all that's left to say is thanks for coming on and taking
It's
part in the interview with us.
absolutely my pleasure, and anytime.
You are